Well, good morning, everyone. Enjoyed all the little whimsies that were up on the board. Today, we're going to be talking about the 20th century, starting with the 1920s and hopefully working our way up into the 50s, 1950s. The big thing, I'm wondering why it's so hard for me to talk. There we go. The big thing to remember today is there are very, very few terms that I want you to remember, but I do feel that we need to make a conclusion to this whole thing. That we need to find a way to get sort of to the end, feel like we've completed the fin de cycle, as one might say. So as we're going through today, the biggest things, there are five, I think, terms in the section for 1920s through the current time. There are a lot of designers, and that's just, again, the sort of place where these people sort of sit. But the big things we'll talk about today, there are very few terms, but I wanted to feel like you get the sense of where we are and see how society has changed. Sound good? Awesome. So the biggest thing that we focus on in this period is silhouette. And when we're talking about silhouette, what's very interesting is we see very dynamic changes. Because when we say, oh, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, we think of these very, very huge changes. And yes, for society, especially as we move into the 1920s, yes, we feel it because it's so different. But really, if we look at the entirety of the 20th century, even into the 21st century, it probably doesn't look as dynamic as one would think. Because what we tend to focus on in the 20th century is just a simple shape on the body, especially for women. Men are even more, sometimes we'll pull a suit out of stock and we'll be like, what year is it? It could be the 30s, it could be the 70s, it could be the 40s. Because we're looking at little tiny things that really separate everything. Now, as we're looking at this sequence from about 1920 to about 1950, for women, we're looking at proportions. And the proportions in a lot of ways are shoulder to waist, hem to floor, and then the shape of the torso. And pretty much everything else is anything goes. So when we're looking at these, and those of you who are at home, you can see the same thing that everybody is seeing here on the board. We're moving very quickly. If you think about that turn of the century into 1920, we're moving very quickly into a modern style. Now, there are lots of ways one could say, where did this come from? But as we look at it, we have to take a lot of factors into account. And one of the things is this modern movement that we eventually call Art Deco, right? The idea of the Art Deco is that we are taking and compounding the idea of the Art Nouveau, which is simplifying things, but we take it even further to the degree that we simplify things down to geometric shapes. And in some ways, though the term Art Deco isn't really hit until about 1925 with a Paris exhibition called Art Scheperelli, we can see the rumblings of it happening quite early. And when we think about these dresses from the 20s, we can see that they are pretty geometric in a lot of ways. Now, I have brought in three outfits here. So you can hey, Saucy. She's been trying to get this dress off all day. But these are sort of forms of the pillow slip, the simplest of dresses that we would consider from the 1920s. And if you notice, they're basically boxes from the shoulders over the bosom to the hip. And the hip line, though, is actually the waistline, right? We've dropped that waist. Now, we've seen a dropped waist before, but none quite to this degree. And if we think about that sort of sensuality that was coming out of the teens and the simplicity of line, in these, we can see a very similar idea. Most of the action is smooth to that new waistline, and then anything happens, right? Anything happens from that point down. So sometimes we see gathered skirts, sometimes we see circle skirts or full skirts, or sometimes we see straight skirts. But the hardest thing to kind of grasp about dresses in the 1920s is they have little to no fit. We're very used to shaping, and have been for many years, this idea of shaping towards the waist. Even if it's an accentuated waist or a drop waist or even a high waist, we sort of have this coming back to the body somewhere. What makes this pillow slip, and we can understand why it's called a pillow slip, right? The idea of like a pillowcase, as we might call it here, it really feels like we just took a rectangle and we cut a hole and dropped it on. But if we look at this one, and this is a real one from the 1920s, you can see there's no fit lines in it, right? There's no darting, there's no seaming. And so everything is based on, in a lot of ways, the hip measurement. If we look at this one, now this is a recreation that I did for a production. Sometimes you'll see a small bit, like up here, there's a dart, right? There's a little bit of fit just to control around the bosom. And then if we look at this one, we can see that it actually is completely rectangular, even down to the skirt. There's no shaping, there's no gores, there's no godets, until maybe you get to the hem for a little bit of whimsy. Now, when we think of the 1920s, what is kind of the first word that comes to your mind as far as women's clothes? Flapper. We use that word flapper. Now, flapper is a pretty American term overall, but there are a lot of, in the ways that we go about the world, there are a lot of urban legends, I guess you can say, where this term came from. We tend to think of what when we think of a flapper dress?
Lots of fringe.
Yeah. Something that moves, right? Mm-hmm. Fringe or panels or texture, and there is something to that. But when we look at these dresses, we're not going to see many dresses like that in existence. Now, some of it may be, though fringe was popular, it's not de rigueur. It actually probably came from costume shops in the 60s and 70s, trying to create quick costumes. So you take a rectangle and you throw some fringe on it, and boom, you've got a costume, right? We do see some fringe, but it's not that sort of stereotypical idea of a flapper costume. There are many different ways where the term flapper came from, and we always learned, which is kind of proven to be untrue, that the fashionable footwear for young women, and you have to remember that flappers are sort of implying youth movement, a young, active woman. Think of the Gibson Girl 3.0, right? One of the most fashionable footwear were galoshes. What are galoshes?
Like welly boots?
Kind of. They're kind of like what you're wearing right now. But they're a rubber boot that you would wear. But what galoshes have are clasps up the front, right? To close them to your ankle. And what we learned was that the term flapper came because they would wear them open and they would flap. Now, another sort of take on this, which is kind of interesting, is in England, they call young women birds, right? And so the idea of the flap were the birds leaving the nest. But it does imply a very active, youthful young woman, right? Somebody who maybe smokes, maybe drinks, has a lot of fun. So I do want you to remove that idea of the fringe dresses being the only thing, but understand that it does come from this idea of wherever the waistline is, activity can happen after that point. So here we're seeing three forms of the pillow slip dress. The two on the outside are evening dresses, right? We can tell they're evening dresses because they don't have sleeves, though it is okay to not wear sleeves every once in a while for day dresses. But we do still see sleeves, as we see in this sort of day outfit here with little, sort of ruffled sleeves there. But because of its simplicity, the textile often takes on a great deal of interest, right? We're going to do well-placed ideas. So whether it's a graphic print, we see sort of an Art Deco-iness to this, or, and this looks very Baroque, right, in its textile, but you can see that it's laid out very clearly. Or in this case, where it's mostly the silk doing the work, and then we have this addition of the lace and these embroidered, or not, well, there's some embroidery there, but it's mostly applique flowers on it. It's giving us a sense of form and where we are and who we are within these clothes. And we can see three very different women in these dresses, right? Now, one of the things that we see here on this sort of pink, or what we would call shell color dress, is this is the color of nudity in a lot of ways. So we see dresses that often will match the color of the skin of the wearer. And when you really see them, they're not quite as good as you probably would like them to be. And we see them in all sorts of, I have a beautiful sort of a mocha colored one downstairs that unfortunately has seen such a better day. But it is kind of a naked period in some ways, trying to feel light and naked. And in this case, if you notice, you can see that the hem for the dress is actually shorter, and then the lace goes over, so you get a little peekaboo too. Now, most of these dresses do hit below the knee. We have this image, this modern image of them being sky high. They tend to be a little bit, at the knee or below the knee, because then when you move, you see the knee. And you would have hosiery that you would see as well. And we'll talk about how that works. But the idea of the pillow slip is to be as simple as possible. Now, the second style that finds its way, and it's a little silly, but is the robe de style. Does the robe de style remind us of anything? Panier, exactly. They are pulled from 18th century ideas, and they're like, oh, let's put panier in these pillow slip dresses. And they do look flat from side to side, but they do have it. Now, unfortunately, I have a robe de style, but it as well has just seen its better day. It can't hold up on a dress form, so it doesn't make much sense. But it is a variation on that pillow slip. But you notice that it still goes well past the waist into that drop waist form, the hip form, and then it vertically goes out. And we see that in play. But what it does influence in some ways is fullness down at the bottom of the skirt in a very different way than this. So the robe de style is really with the panier, but it also starts to influence kind of the movement in this world. Does that make sense? So if you could put a panier, I guess, under that if you wanted to. And that would be on a separate slip altogether. And when we look at these, and we have this sort of idea that all of the conventions of underwear that we have worn before have been thrown out the window, right? That's what we kind of think about the 1920s. But in truth, they still wear stay. They still wear quote unquote corsets. They just do different things. Why would you need foundation garments underneath this? These garments. Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I think of is that maybe it would shift and move too much, so to like help the fabric stay a bit more.
Okay, so foundation garments in some way will help these garments stay in place so they don't move around. Do you notice anything about the silhouette of these three?
You have to be very flat chested.
Okay, so the style that was popular was called le garçon. What does that mean? The boy, exactly. And to achieve le garçon, that style. Often what you would do is you would minimize your chest. So in a sense, like binding we might have today, you would wear foundation garments that would flatten you as much as possible through the chest, and then try to flatten the hips as well. And because we have elastic, because we do have some things like that, we would need to accommodate our body, but to achieve the most fashionable silhouette, this is really where you're going. Because if you think you have, say, a fuller chest, that basically mathematically sets the tone for the entirety of the dress, right? Wherever your chest is and wherever your hip is, and it's a big rectangle, we won't want to necessarily do that. So we do tend to see, as opposed to the 18th or the 19th century, where we were emphasizing the roundness of our breasts, or the 1990s, we're going to actually try to make ourselves as tubular as possible. The last thing I want you to think about in this is the overall intention, though, is that it is lightweight, that it's just being thrown on the body. And so we tend to see a lot of very delicate fabrics, like even this one, which is taffeta, silk taffeta. That's pretty unlikely in a lot of ways because it has too much structure. These garments, they have movement and they have lightness that sort of shift to the body. When you see old films from the 1920s, what is kind of interesting, and because this is just the way the world works, often we see dresses like this. You see that little bit of a difference? They start shaping them for movies because they don't want to feel like blocks. But the fashionable thing we see is there. And that does have an actual impact on our lives. Film, as we're going to see through all of these clothes, is going to be the way that we transmit fashion in a lot of ways. Because almost as soon as it's made, it's put out and people can see it, and they see it in 3 dimensions, right? No longer do we have those old stuffy flat pictures. We can see 3 dimensions, and so we see styling, we see all the little details that sort of influence us. And it's like Instagram in a lot of ways, right? You go to the movies and you see all the fashionable things that are happening and all the styles that are going on. So the 1920s, we want to think rectangular. Now, the Art Deco moves into the 1930s as well. However, we start to take up a different shape. And this is the battle that we seem to have through the 20th century, which is, I don't want to say completely rectangular, but less body conscious. And then it becomes very body conscious, then kind of less body conscious. And in there, we start to see, here we see rectangle, right? In the 30s, we go back to S-curve, but using the natural body in that way. Then by the time we get to the 40s, we go back to geometry, but the geometry is now triangular geometry. And then by the time we get to the 50s, we're back to S-curve. So we see this kind of play going back and forth. And this is a wedding dress that was made for a show, but is in that 30s style. Now, what do you notice about it? It's very huggy, right? Hugs the body. We see the bosom, it moves into the waist, and then rounds out over the hip. Now, how is that done? No, actually the exact opposite. If you notice, there are very few panels in here. It's only one seam right down the center. And the way we do that is called bias. Now bias, and I'll play it out for you. Bias is this way of cutting in which the textile stretches. Can you see that? You see how it's moving? Now, the idea of bias, and I have a little diagram here on the board, you can see the way we would normally weave, right? And this sort of up and down and across. And we would normally cut on the straight of grain. If you think about these, this is straight, right? It's in the way that that fabric is woven. Bias, we cut things on the diagonal. And when we cut it on the diagonal, what it allows is it allows those fibers that would be like this, right, to now be like this. And so when you pull on them, they collapse a little bit. If you've ever had a screen door, you can stretch that screen on the diagonal, right? It's rigid this way and rigid this way, but you pull on those two corners and it stretches because it collapses. Same exact idea here. And so you need to think about the movement over the body, but it does allow for some flexibility. And you can imagine that because you're using this bias, the weight of the garment is going to pull it down over your body. But because it's stretchy like this, do we need foundation garments?
Well, it feels like it would help too close to get like, you can see every single bit of it.
That's exactly why we need foundation garments. Because your body isn't smooth like that, right? You have hip bumps and you have divots and you have shaping. Often they would wear one-piece foundation garments, very similar to what we saw in the late 19th, early 20th century, that would start at the bosom, go through the waist to control the waist, all the way through the hips, so you don't get lines, you don't get shaping. Even here with this one little seam, can you see that one little seam on the dress form underneath? See how that shows right up? You would want that super smooth, right? You wouldn't want panty lines, as we would call them. So foundation garments become even more important in a lot of ways. And things like bras, girdles, slips, layers and layers and layers underneath this to put the body in the right place and keep it smooth. Yeah, doesn't matter. And the weight itself draws it down. Now, if we look, can you see this little dip right here? See how it's sort of curved, kind of a basque front? That's actually cut rectangularly, right? But what happens once it starts stretching and moving? It starts to become more rounded. And that's actually just from hanging itself. So you can imagine you need to be a master manipulator of fabric. And we sort of credit most of that to a woman named Madame Vionnet. You know, we're thinking about these rectangles that feels like almost anybody could make them. Even the idea of calling it a pillow slip, cut the neck, put your arms through, everybody can be a fashion designer. This requires patience and time and thought because of how the fabric drapes, how it moves over the body, how it's graceful. It's so this idea of bias, which we do see come back every once in a while, becomes of incredibly sought after style and influences the 30s. So the 30s, again, are much more S form. And we notice the waist tending to be at the back at the natural waist, an emphasis on the breasts and the hips being rounded, the waist being smaller. And we see the skirt length get longer down to mid-calf. Now, what happens in the 1930s in America and basically all over the world? We're starting on World War II, but the Great Depression also has an impact on that, which starts at the beginning of the 30s. And one of the challenges of 1930s bias cut dresses is they waste a lot of textile. And so we have issues of what is the most fashionable and people trying to create things in different ways. So I have some 30s gowns that are actually cut on the straight of grain because it takes less fabric, but it doesn't drape over the body. It's kind of, I mean, you ever worn like, we have them today, shift dresses, you know, like they're not bodycon stretchy, but they're shape shift dresses. And those don't have much movement, you know, they sort of hold your body in, where these do have a little bit more movement and shape and flow in them. So anyway, and again, we have to thank the movie industry for really pushing the styles that come out of the 1930s, because it is such a land of escapism, especially when we think about, you know, going into the Depression, that it sort of becomes, you know, like the kings and queens, that we can't afford the things that they have. And so they make them even more desirable in a lot of ways. Moving from the 30s, as we had said, you know, we're starting to get into war. We're starting to need to reevaluate clothing completely, because all of our textiles are going to be sent overseas for war in America. In England, in France, everybody has to ration fabric. And so we see a dynamic change happening as we move into the war times into limited use of fabric. And so is bias the best world? No, because it's wasting so much fabric. Everything is going to be much more narrow and much more conservative in cut. And because we don't have as much textile available to us, we're going to be reusing things, redeveloping things, and being kind of happy with what we have. So here we see what we call today like an A-line skirt, right? Just a very simple skirt with a few darts for shaping, and we still see some movement, but it is a little boxy. Now, this idea of shoulder pads becomes popular, and this is actually sort of developed in the 1930s, and we're going to see how that happens. But eventually we go from that rounded shoulder into a rectangular shoulder where we have pads. And here we see two forms of the dress. So here we see just a simple day dress. And you notice it has a little bit of broadness at the shoulder, a little bit of blousing at the waist, still hitting the waist. Can you see that a little bit better, Fiona? Great. Still hitting at the waist. And then a simple skirt. But it's still trying to put everything together as simply as possible. And in fact, this is made out of rayon, which is what we call synthetic silk. Does anybody know what rayon is made of? Anybody had rayon clothes? Maybe? So rayon is wood. They basically boil down wood and turn it into a pulp and then put it through an extruder. And it has a really nice drape to it, but it's much less expensive. And it's kind of, my mom won't wear rayon because she thinks it's cheap. Now here, we see an evening dress. I think this is made out of rayon as well. And you're going to see a dress very similar to this from the 30s. But if we look at it, can you see the shoulder pads in there? You can sort of see it right through. Sorry, Kim. You can see it shadowing right through. So that tells us it's probably 40s. But it's also cut on the straight of grain. But then if you notice, it just has very simple detailing happening on it and something that is thought through. But each of these fringes are individually tied. Can you see? So it would take work to create it, but it doesn't take materials. It doesn't take expensive stuff to make something happen. So it's about craftsmanship. But look at that. Come on. It's pretty cool, isn't it? But even notice the skirt, how it's very straight, not very much fullness in it. That also helps us know that it's 40s. And then finally, after the war, we have what's called the new look. And can you see how dynamically different that is compared to everything we've seen so far? Why would silhouettes change so dramatically after the war? Yes. Okay, so now, how can we pack more fabric into things, right? What else?
It's very accentuates the feminine, which is like the 40s is a lot boxier.
Right. And so there's this kind of mindset of the return to normalcy, I guess you could say, which in a lot of ways is sort of going all the way back to kind of the turn of the century in some ways, with very full skirts and very languid fit bodices. Now, we credit Christian Dior for inventing this idea of the new look, but we're going to see some ways that it sort of found its way to us. But even if you look at that jacket, can you see how structured and rounded in shape that is? That requires a great deal of not just tailoring, so lots of little pieces to put together, which equals more waste, but also, do you notice the shape in the hip, how dynamic that is? Would you want that to just be floppy? No, you'd want it to be super structured. So again, it's like focus on this idea of well-fit garments. It kind of harkens back again to the beginnings of the 20th century in a lot of ways. And so this idea of tailoring becomes really important. Does that make sense as a big idea? It's a lot of stuff I know. And these are some of my favorite times. So I would sit here and I could do a probably whole semester on all of them. One other thing I wanted, men's clothes, again, pretty boring overall. The suit stays along with us. And as we hit into the 40s and the 50s, we will start to see sportswear even more active. But over here, I have an example of what is called the Zoot Suit. Now, the Zoot Suit was a youth movement, a fashion youth movement that started in the African American, the Chicano culture, and the Filipino culture in Los Angeles. And it was modeled on Cab Calloway. So in the 30s, when he would do his shows, he would wear these very, very large suits, like oversized, very theatrical suits. Does anybody know Talking Heads? Okay, have you ever seen Stop Making Sense? Thank you. So David Byrne in Stop Making Sense wears something kind of similar in an ideal, which is this hugely oversized suit. It's very theatrical. Well, that was the idea of this as well. It was to throw the proportions all out of shape. And how do we look at it? First of all, do you notice the really broad shoulders? Like, look at how much. That's touching the body there. I'll put it on so you can see how broad they actually are. And then, like a frock coat, do you notice how it then moves into the waist very quickly? So it's really triangular and then has a very full sort of skirt. It's worn with very, 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 very full trousers. And even this one is a pretty modest trouser. I made this about probably 14 years ago, 12 years ago. But it's excess. Now, this is coming out in the 30s and into the 40s and into wartime. And there's a very famous thing called the Zoot Suit Riots, which happened, and that's a song. I always want to say Squirrel Nut Zippers, but it's not. Zoot Suit Riot. I can't think of it. Anyway, where they were considered eventually un-American because during the war, you have to imagine how much textile would go into these things, right? Especially with those big, big, full trousers. And you could see that they would be considered to be too flashy and a waste of materials. So zoot suiters used to get caught all the time. And their trousers would get cut, or they, people would tackle them and cut up their suits because they were considered to be a waste of textiles. Yeah, and it's also racial too.
I was gonna say, doesn't that even waste even more fabric? Like they just cut up the suits, like.
You have to remember, when it comes to things like this, it doesn't often make sense. But it is also racist. There is a great deal of racism to go along with it too, so we have to sort of put that in. And there is a great movie about the Mexican American community called Zoot Suit, which was based on a play. And you can read that. It tells kind of the whole chronicle of the Zoot Suit, how important it was to the Mexican American culture. But you can see how broad this is, right? Now on me, that's my arm right there. So it's not too bad, but still, you can see it's a very dynamic, very theatrical silhouette. Okay? I know, we move through it fast. Molly, do you mind hitting the lights? So what we're going to do, everybody at home see this okay? So we're going to move through this, even though we're going to see lots of slides, because it's like babies to me, like which is my Sophie's choice, getting rid of images, it's almost impossible. But just to give you a big overview of the whole idea. And if you want, this one is being recorded, so you can always go back and look at more stuff. I could even send you the PowerPoint if you really wanted to. But here we're seeing Art Deco, and you can see how it is inspired by the Art Nouveau, but very different. Can you see how on the Chrysler Building, they've used geometry, these circles and triangles, to create something that feels semi-organic, right? It feels like a sunrise or a sunset. And if we look at Rockefeller Center here, which every time I look at this, I think of Cheesecake Factory for some reason, but you see these columns, which are modeled on Egyptian columns, And there is kind of a mathematical organicness to it. Kind of feels like trees, but it also feels kind of pseudo-Egyptian, which was very important at this time because this is when they found King Tutankhamun's tomb and opened it up. So there's this whole Egypt mania that happened.
But when they ate the mummies, or was that earlier?
That was earlier.
Okay.
And if you look here, you can see a beautiful lighting system, very Art Deco, but it also reads a little bit arts and crafts movement, very Frank Lloyd Wright. But it's everything breaking down into geometry. I don't know why I'm using this, because that won't work. Here we can see an Erte drawing with some people in it, but you can see the geometry or the Art Deco-ness in there as well. Even the smoke that they're sort of wafting up has kind of a mystical yet geometry going about it with this big window and everything behind that being very simple. And down here we can see pajama, right? This idea of a relaxation at home outfit, which is scandalous because trousers, right? But though we will see trousers, we won't see them in the wild really until the 1940s. Okay, the movement of silhouette, you can see this is all the way from like 1919 all the way to about 1970. And when you see it on this scale, there's so little to really happen, right? I mean, it's I don't want to deny anybody who studies the 20th century for fashion, but really, all you're noticing is waistlines, hemlines, fullness here and there. It's pretty amazing that it probably will look pretty plain like we look at, some of the periods we look at. But what is kind of interesting is we see some correlation between the 1920s and the 1960s and the 1930s and 40s into the 1970s. And in fact, the 40s, if you think about like this silhouette and this blue right here, that could easily transfer into a 1980s dress. So we see this idea of revival come up over and over and over again, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about next time. But so here we see 1923. Is this what you think of for 20s dresses? Yeah, in some ways, we can see that dropped waist. We can see the rectangularness, but notice the length, right? It still feels very Edwardian. And certainly, if you were a person of a certain age, you wouldn't want to take on one of those very short dresses, but you get all of the right proportions in there. And what I love about these two dresses here at the bottom, can you see there's almost like a fake hem that would be at the fashionable hem, and then there's like an elongation after that. So it's sort of being like, oh, I understand what fashion is. It's called fashion, Karen. But this is what we think of, right? We think of these languid whispers of dresses that sort of fall over our body. And you'll notice too, in a lot of these illustrations, people are contorted and hands are here, again, to show your waist, right? But if you look at them, they're pretty rectangular. And usually the more dropped they feel, the more fashionable they're trying to be as well. But we get a sense of that very clean silhouette, sort of from shoulder all the way to hem. And notice for evening, these are actually quite long. Not everybody is wearing little tiny shorty guys. But notice the hair very close to the head. We'll talk about hair. And this is what we think of, right? It's pretty much a perfect pillow slip dress in a lot of ways. There's a little bit of asymmetricality, which is still kind of carrying over. Even if you look at the dresses that we have here, you'll see asymmetricality. But rectangular here, little bit of lace thrown on it for whimsy, very carefully placed, Art Deco-y, Art Nouveau-y flowers on it, and it's done. And in fact, I try to color correct a little bit better. This is actually a pale green. You can see a little bit better here, but I'm still having calibration issues with it. But still, very simple, and it looks like lingerie, right? It looks like the body is super exposed. Here we can see some, cultural appropriation. Hooray! But you can see this kind of Chinese embroidery on the front in this tunic style, which is sort of pulled from, Asian culture. You can see that sleeve, which feels again, kind of, Asian inspired. All that beautiful embroidery on it and tunic shape. But what I really like about this is notice the skirt. This idea, it looks like woven ribbon, right? And I'm fascinated with it, always have been fascinated. But again, totally tube. And even here in the silhouette, can you see there's almost no definition of the breast? Here we can see another one, but these are three very different people, aren't they? Right? This one being super sheer, but certainly with the lace details and such, it feels a bit more covered up in some ways, even though this one is like completely embroidered and dark and heavy. For some reason, this one feels more demure. But you'll notice that it even has kind of like three waists on it, right? It has a lace waist and then the physical waist and then the lace waist below that. But you can see that it's sheer and we would just see a slip underneath it. Like I said, we're going to be moving through these really fast. I'm sorry, folks. They're so beautiful. Here we can see more pillow slip dresses with the exception of this white one in the center. Now, would I call that a robe de style? Not quite, but you can see that emphasis at the hip that they're trying to create. And you can see that the textiles in these drapings, in these movements would be incredibly important, right? They'd need to have soft body to them. They couldn't be too rigid or they would just stick out. And you can even see in this white form, can you see that little break? That little break in the wedge there? And then notice everything is, to be pulled down and as long as possible. And if you notice, you can't see knees, right? It's just at the knees, but of course, we've extended our individual. And we can see many, many different names in here, including Chanel, Poiret, I think. Here we see a great little dress. And this is adding to that idea of the garçon, which is called the blousin, right? It's adding that blousiness like we saw at the pigeon front sort of boxiness. And you can imagine this would make you feel even more triangular. And then notice that the skirt itself is very full, very active, but super interesting. And also notice there's kind of a folk wear quality to it. It feels sort of Russian. It feels kind of West Asian in some ways. But this is probably what it looked like. It kind of feels like a bag, doesn't it? Right? Because you could see all that extra fabric in there that you could put it on a fashion model, as often happens, and it looks so different than probably on the human body. But you can see that they're using, like in this case, the stripes to emphasize and move it across the body in different ways. And you can see how long that one actually is. Here's a blouse in one. I mean, like, it's kind of like an A+ concept. I don't know. I guess it's like a C- follow through. It just feels disproportionate. It feels like it's a lot of hip happening. The coat, though, does help a little bit, right? It does skim over it. But if you look right here, your eye doesn't sort of sit here. It really sort of sits down here at the waist. Now, here we can see some slight fit, but not too terrible much going on here. And then you can see all the activity happening here below. But what I love about this is look at the boots. We think about these sort of like little Mary Jane shoes, but there were all sorts of kind of weird pairings of clothes, not just galoshes, but those look like a boot that you could pick up, at Nordstrom's today, or at least fall season, not spring. But we could tell this is actually from the 1920s by the rest of what's happening here, the face, the spit curls, the cloche hat. But those boots, I just love. Look at them. This one's kind of boot hosey, right? Sort of folded down. Love it. Here we can see an evening gown. And you can see some fit has been created ever so slightly through the smocking on the sides. But really, it is rectangular in a lot of ways. And this one, as a few others that we're going to see, actually employ what we call trompe-l'oeil. So what is trompe-l'oeil? Go ahead, Fiona. Oh, you don't know?
Oh, it's like very top decoration.
It is, but it's a representation of something three-dimensional in a two-dimensional form. So if you look at this, can you see necklaces? Can you see sashes? Can you see things that feel like separate pieces? Those are actually all flat. And so, like even right here, I think this fringe is loose, but this feels like a necklace that's coming down and then going back up. And if you took first semester, you'll even see there's kind of this Egyptian pairing. It feels like necklaces, but they're actually sewn in place. Let me show you another great one. Oh, hey. So this is modeled on a Greek vase. But doesn't it look like there's an actual sash around the waist? But it's not, it's woven into it. It's giving the effect that there's something there that actually isn't there. And you can see how sheer it is. What I really love, look at this hem. So they're using, these little zigzags down at the bottom and opening it up. And then it has this sort of tippet, which was from the Middle Ages, that goes around the arm, and then sort of this long, dramatic tassel. Here we can see a beautiful ensemble. I think this is Chanel as well. And we can see that it's just a simple velvet coat and a simple dress with some tiers. But notice that the lining of the coat matches, telling us that those are to be worn together. But also it sort of ups the game, right? These things are to be worn at the same time. Here we see some great coats. These were very, very popular. These sort of oversized, what we sometimes call cocoon coats, made out of very heavy tapestries lined in fur. And we can see it sort of matches that style coming all the way down. And this, along with a number of things, were inspired by the Harlem Renaissance too. We can't deny, especially in America, the impact that the Harlem Renaissance had on fashion. And in some ways, those flapper dresses that we think of are really modeled on costumes that would be worn at the Cotton Club and at some of these clubs, that have activity in them. So we're going to see a lot of really interesting, kind of over the top but fabulous stuff that was probably modeled on the Harlem Renaissance. And here we can see all sorts of different coats, but everybody's kind of accessorized them ever so slightly. Notice the cloche hats, which are very close to the head. Each one has like a different fold and a different detail to it. Look at the Stone Martin here, the fox, with the little clippy jaws. If you've ever seen them, they're really frightening and fabulous. I hate fur, but there we are. So here we see a robe de style. This is Lanvin. And you can see it's rectangular here. And again, notice it looks like it has a tied over kind of shawly, busty thing, but that's all trompe-l'oeil to keep it all smooth. But can you notice the horizontalness here? It has pannier in it. And here we see kind of a see-through of a lace dress. Very pillow slippy up at the top, right? Just a rectangle. But then can you see the very sort of sheer pannier underneath it? Just like the pannier I showed the pocket panniers in the 18th century. And then everything from there is sort of boxy down. And we can see so many different types of textiles being used, whether it's these sort of soft velvets or these laces or these silks. You really can create character through it. Here's a presentation gown. I believe, and you can see the robe de style in here as well, right? And you can see that it is pretty boxy. The mannequin, the dress form they used underneath probably needs to be sort of re-evaluated just a little bit to get the bust up a bit. But you can see how they're using all the details in there. And notice there's a little rococo-ness to it too, with these little flowers. It's pretty great. Here we can see a show costume, but we can see that kind of robe de style idea emphasized in multiple skirts, fullness down. And just a stupid one that I just love so much. I call this the paint by number dress, but it is, you can see it's just, pillow slip, 1922. And this is trompe l'oeil as well. It looks like a suspender holding onto a skirt, but really it's all just a piece of printed textile. Here we see some play clothes in different forms. Here we see bathing suits getting a little scandalous. And then we can see the gentlemen in bathing suits as well.
Use wool for bathing suits, like it's heavy. Aren't there better fabrics?
Not at this point. And everything else, wool resists water, right? Its intention is not to absorb water in the same way. And silk and cotton and linen just don't hold up in the same way. They don't knit very well. I love showing this too, not only because of the shoes, which are awesome, but about the stockings. So stockings are still pretty shaped. And in fact, if you would buy stockings, you'd buy size stockings. We think about these super elastic, one size fits most sort of stuff. But in truth, they would, even though they would be knit, they would have very little movement. And what I love seeing here is the imperfection. Can you see how it's like a little buckly right down in through here? And these are probably silk, but they could be made out of cotton, they could be made out of rayon, they could be made out of all sorts of things. But certainly as the war comes on, we have some issues with stockings. Here we see some different hairstyles from the period that were popular. Certainly we understand the bob, but also this idea of perming your hair became very popular. And you can see that sort of Orphan Annie, curl fiesta going on there. And then through that process, you can also permanently wave your hair to create the most fashionable as we move into the 30s, which is the Marcel wave. And this is the way that you would actually perm your hair. First, you'd put chemicals on your hair, and then you'd put electrodes and heat on them, and it would set it and keep it permanent into your hair to some degree. And that would take a great deal of time, but that's where little Orphan Annie gets her sort of style. So she's really fashionable. Here we can see a very sort of bob as we understand a bob. But what's really swell here is we can see somebody who is sort of using the spirit of the bob, but manipulating their hair because they don't want to maybe cut it, right? So we see these kind of Princess Leia curlers on the side of the head going on here. As we move out of the 20s into the 30s, we're going to see that body conscious shaping starting to develop. And we're going to start to see these rectangles get into more lyrical shapes. So this is from like 1931. And by the time we're in the 30s, what we're looking at here is underwear. And you can see how lingerie is going to pick up because lingerie is going to be so important. You have on, where's the foundation garment? It's hiding here somewhere, isn't it? No, not really. But if you had foundation garments, you would then need to put on a slip on top of that in silk to sort of keep the dress from clinging to your body. And so you can see all different types of lingerie that would be possible, from the brassiere and the sort of half sort of cami pants, as we sometimes call those, full slips in many ways. We can even see sort of what we might call today bloomers or such in there, and then half slips as well, which just sort of come to the waist. So you can see how lingerie would be incredibly important. Here we can see some foundation garments in different forms. Look at this one. I mean, that's that pretty much that Edwardian style that we were looking at, right? To smooth the entirety of the body overall. But we can also see lighter forms of things that we could use. That's a girdle, just a knit girdle to sort of control those hips. And so if you think about that first suit that we saw, and now looking at this suit, we can still see kind of the dropped waist, but we're starting to see it move into a much more lyrical form. Hey. And here we can see, as we're moving into the 30s, a little bit more of the dress style. Notice that the lengths are getting longer. They're starting to mold to the body ever so slightly. But this one is really about that center dress, because these other textiles, we can't tell that they're cut on the bias, but the center one tells us it is. So this would be the straight of grain, the way those stripes are. But you can imagine that the top is cut on the diagonal. This hip panel is cut on the diagonal, so it drapes a little bit better. But then notice that their gored skirt with godets inserted into it on the bias, so it would move and flip very differently. Here we can see some evening gowns. This one basically is the same silhouette as that evening, the wedding dress that is over there, right? And you can see there's almost no seams in it because we're really focusing on the length and the languidness of it. And even here, we're still sort of seeing some blousing happening, but even look here, we see less over on this one here. So we're starting to see it connect to the body very differently. And here's a perfect example of kind of a bias cut evening gown. It's a beautiful piece of heavyweight silk satin, drapes over the body, little bit of blousiness maybe up here, but really we're trying to get to the mermaid shape as much as possible. And what makes this gorgeous too is this jacket that was made to go with it. Here we can see Scheperelli. Now, Scheperelli was a designer at the time and was really influenced by the surrealism movement, and like Dali, like Jean Cocteau, and tried to make incredibly playful clothing. And again, I could go on and on for a whole class about Scheperelli because she's so fabulous. But one of her most famous dresses from the 30s was this, La Goustière, or the lobster dress. And this is just, huh?
I would wear that today.
Yeah, well, we would certainly wear this today because it feels like stuff that we probably have seen, but it's so weird to everybody because this is just painted on. You know, it's not fancy, it's nothing special, but certainly modeled on Dali. And we can see the little details. Here's some of the other things that she liked to do, very playful, like this one. If you look, you can see the profiles, right? But then you can also see it's that optical illusion of the vase in the center with then the flowers on it. Or this one being very trompe-l'oeil as well, with the hair coming down the sleeve, the hand coming back with the gloves, right at the placement of the pocket, right in there. She even has a very famous suit that's called Le Smoking. And you know the little pocket that is right here on suits? Oh, it's not there anymore, but sometimes we have where we put the handkerchief. That is a cigarette. And then when the lapel comes over, the lapel is shaped like a face. So the cigarette falls into the mouth. It's really swell. She's really swell. And we start to see advertising like this. Now, again, I can't push enough the impact that movies have on fashion, and especially the idea of the makeup business. Because up until this point, makeup was still considered to be sort of back counter stuff. But now that people in movies are wearing it, they have to wear it. It starts to become so popular in the 20s and into the 30s, where it's then you're not put together unless you wear makeup, right? We know that you're wearing makeup. So here we can see in these 30s, all these sort of like styles that we became popular through makeup. Here we see a beautiful dress on Josephine Baker. And again, notice, I mean, there's definitely makeup happening there, right? False eyelashes, mascara, but look at that lip. I mean, nothing says 30s more to me than a really super beautiful lip. And then we can see how this dress, this bias dress, just hugs right to the body all the way down. And that idea of that silk satin. And somebody like, her name just escaped me. It was there, and then I was thinking of silk satin, and then I went away. It'll come to me in a second. But notice how that films, how that silk satin films so beautifully with that sheen. It doesn't look flat. It emphasizes the body. Jean Harlow, it's right there. It was there, I promise you. But then also notice her hair. That ain't real, my friends. That's a bottle if you've ever known a bottle. But notice how that films as well, you know. Here we can just see some 30s dresses that sort of mix it up, but still kind of follow the silhouette. Now, this is a very famous dress by Adrian, and Adrian was a film costume designer and eventually became a fashion designer as well. And he designed the costumes for tons of movies. Three of my favorites: Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind,
Oh, I knew
and
Gone with the Wind.
The Women. So if you have never seen The Women, it takes place in 1939. It's amazing. But this is Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford had exceptionally full shoulders, and she was being played as an ingenue. And so what he decided to do was, instead of trying to recut it, put crap on it. Because now it looks like the clothes are disproportionate, right? And not the dress itself. It makes her look like the shape that was fashionable. And eventually this leads into the 1940s with that broad shoulder silhouette that she was so known for. So we see it find its way into a lot of this shaping. See this one? It's even saying, you need to wear this to look like this. Am I not? Oh, I'm hitting the wrong key altogether. But notice here, and notice that this is beautifully done in an organza where you see the seams, I mean, again, workmanship has to be done really well. And you can see that broadness here. And again, everything is about Hollywood fashion. This is from the mid-30s as well. And you can see, especially here, that bias would be doing all the work, right? Because there are no seams in it whatsoever. And certainly, Gone with the Wind is going to have some impact. And we can see the crinoline in this, yes? Sure. But notice the bodices don't feel like the bodices we saw in the crinoline period. They feel very much, in some ways, this sort of shaping. But we're going to see little revivals happening. And certainly this happens in 1939, 10 years later, we get into the new look. But we're entering war now, so things are going to start to change. Here's this bias cut stuff that Madame Vianney did. Here's a dress that is made out of a single piece that is very carefully folded. Or we can even see here, look how fabulous that is, the skirt with then this wrap top. Some of her other fabulous pieces, look at that shaping, right? And though this isn't trompe l'oeil, that is permanent to some degree. The only thing I think that is loose is right there, so you can actually tie it over the zipper. But look how dramatic that is and how fit to the body that is. Or this one, look a little familiar? So this one is cut on the bias, and notice how, they're using the bias probably for some of the stretch, but the fringe is adding weight to it. And it's just like the fringe dress that you see over there, except on the bias, but you can see each one is very carefully knotted into place. Here's some day dresses made out of just super light chiffon that are playful. And you can even see them through here. See, it's sort of biasing over, but painting that kind of watercolorness on the textile gives it an even more of a lightness. I know, who wouldn't want to own this? But think about that. You'd have to, no bra, you'd have to really think about your foundation garments going into that. Two more Scheperelli, and these sort of moved. I don't know why it keeps moving, but one of her most famous things was in surrealism was this idea of the shoe hat, right? But then look down at the pockets of the jacket being lips. This is a Caloswers dress, and you can see very clearly that it's bias, right? It's made out of silk scarves, so it's cut on the bias, and they leave it as it is. It's kind of great. Here we see some men from the 20s in casual outfits wearing what we call +4s, right? Very breech-like, but also notice these Fair Isle sweaters and the short ties and the white shirts. Very 1920s. But as we move through the 30s, we tend to see boxiness coming back into suits. And notice what's missing from a lot of these? Right. 3-piece starts to become 2-piece. And if we think about the Depression as well, it's one less piece that you need to have. And so basically going forward from the late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, waistcoats kind of disappear and are more luxury. Again, suits are suits. We see little details like this one has a peak collar, this one has a notch collar. We can see the ties are really going to play anything that we have as far as personality. Like 99% of our personality is going to be our ties. And there we see some more suits, including the double-breasted suit, which when you wear double-breasted, you don't wear a waistcoat with it. So there's the Zoot Suit. Here's Cab Calloway, and look at the dimensions of that, just really theatrical. And in fact, this is one of the only Zoot Suits that we have in the wild, meaning that it's a person Zoot Suit. We have Cab Calloway suits, but not this one. This one went up for auction. They found it in Cleveland, I think. They thought it was going to go for maybe a couple $1,000s. Then all of a sudden they saw a lot of interest, so they moved it up to $8,000. How much do you think this Zoot Suit sold for? $75,000. $75,000. And it's common clothing in a way. I mean, it's not. It's of the people. So there's something really important about having that and seeing that. You can see how blousy those trousers are, and it's in incredible shape. Here we see play clothes, more play clothes, and I love these big palazzo pants. When you're standing, what does it look like? A skirt, right? But then you move, and then you can see that they're actually palazzos. Playing bocce. And here we see some sort of beach outfits, super cute. We'd still wear these today, right? And then as we move into the 40s, we see this silhouette starting. And this again is Adrian. You can see those really strong shoulders and this very tiny waist sort of being built, but it has a lot of masculine quality to it. And some of that came from this idea that when all the men went away from war, they sold patterns that you could take apart your husband's suit, lay down the patterns onto the suit, recut it, and make a suit for yourself. So we see kind of this masculine influence in clothing, but notice that it's very clean. And in fact, here's a pattern that would allow you to do that and show you how to put all the pieces on the suit pieces. Here we see a day dress. And again, some kick, some fun, but it's still pretty controlled. And a lot of that is because of the war effort. We really had to be careful about how much we were bringing forward. So there were actual rules for every piece of clothing, how much textile could go into it, how full the skirt could be, how full the bodice could be. And so those little details really made the difference. Here we see, 400 different permutations of the same A-line skirt, or different versions of the blouse, all the same kind of pattern, but just how do we make it different? Here we can see how hair becomes important, because if you can't really afford new dresses, accessories and details become important. And so we see these incredibly gorgeous hairstyles happening in the 40s, whether it's victory curls or this idea of side sweeps, kind of pompadour styles that become so beautiful and so kind of caught in the idea of the 40s. Here we even see, these sort of pulled up with these victory curls in them. Look how gorgeous that is. And even the idea of down hair, because you can't wash it every day, you can't do as much with it as you would normally do. Here we see some evening dresses, and notice it's kind of like a shaped bodice and then a rectangle of fabric, but it's the details in there. How do we add a little bit extra to make it feel special? Or something like this, which actually it looks very fancy, but this could be made out of scraps in some ways. You have a couple yards of one textile, a couple yards of another textile, put them together, throw some plastic beads on it and some embroidery, and you're good to go. Here we see Rita Hayworth in a very, 40s dress in a lot of ways, but just perfectly cut, perfectly shaped. But if you notice, very little extra fabric or textile in this. Here we see just a regular dress, and you notice some detail on there, but things like sequins and beads and such were considered extreme. So often we see like little bits of studs, like nail heads, or people reusing things that they had. Here we see another beautiful 40s dress, and you notice that it's very blousing, again, very rectangular, but lots of shape going on down here with just a few perfect little pleats. Stockings. So stockings, as I said, were very fit. And so during the war effort, silk and rayon were needed for the war effort. So it was very hard to get stockings. And if you notice, they're very specific. They have this heel cap and they have that seam. And so what they started doing was selling paint and pencils. And so you would rub on your legs the paint to look like you were wearing stockings, and then you draw a seam up the back of your leg to look like it had the seams. Because that's what we did, because we wanted to wear stockings. All good girls wore stockings, you know. And here we can see a few other things, like accessories like hats, shoes, and gloves become really popular. And some great shoes, what we would call baby doll shoes today. But they look contemporary. They look like something that would come in and out of fashion every once in a while. And then the last thing I want to talk about as we transfer into the new look was at the end of the war, the Paris fashion system said, we need to do something. We can't do these big fashion shows because we don't have a ton of fabric. So what are we going to do? We're going to create an exhibit called the Théâtre de la Mode, or the Theater of Modernity, or the Modern Theater, in which we're going to make, I think they're 14.5-inch dolls with couture garments on them. And I say couture because these garments have zippers, buttons, snaps. The scarves, handbags are made by Hermes. The shoes are made by Ferragamo. The gloves have seams in them. And you can see the level of workmanship. And again, remember, these are about this big. And it was just room after room after room after room to show all these designers' ideas off. But you have to remember, when you're working on that level, if you've ever had a Barbie doll before and you put a dress on them, the fabric sticks out, right? So if these are smaller, there's going to be a lot more sort of fullness to it. And there's part of me that thinks that adds to the idea of getting to the new look, because those skirts, even if they're cut in a circle, they're going to stand out more. Here we can see a few of them. I mean, this is entirely beaded, zipper up the back, hat. Here we see gloves. On this one, we see, you know, Ferragamo shoes and a hat. And these are in America, actually. They're at Marymount College, I think, somewhere in Washington State. But it leads us to 1947 with Christian Dior's new look. And you can see, this is called the bar suit, one of the most famous elements from the period. And you can see how dynamic that silhouette is, right? From where we came from, the 1940s. And just as we were saying, packing in as much textile as possible. This skirt just looks like an A-line skirt, but it's actually triple knife pleated. So when you open it up, it's like 16 yards of textile. I mean, it's just crazy. And here we can see it out on the street. And you can see how this is going to influence the 1950s in a lot of ways in its shaping. But the rise of couture becomes so incredibly important. And when we look at it, you know, here we're seeing some visions of shaping, but look at the blue one. That looks like an 18th century stay. If you take out the Madonna Gautier bust cups, you can even see the stitching of the channels that looks exactly like the 18th century. And then with this blue skirt over it, it almost looks like an open gown, like a modeste in a jupe or a cyclé underneath. Or this little bit of detail that's happening here, right? You can tell that that's hand done. That can't be just done on a machine. And so we see details really leading that couture idea that we know today, things that can't just be done by everyone, whether it's beading or textiles, it's luxury. And here we're going to see a few, the last one, we actually ended at exactly the same spot. I'm so excited. So this is a Christian Dior evening gown, and look at the workmanship that goes into this. Just spectacular. It has a companion piece. One of them is called Venus and one is called Soigné. I can't remember. But look at all that beading. Again, you can't just whip this up at home. Does this look familiar to you, though? Why does it look familiar, Fiona? It is exactly Glinda's dress from Wicked. In fact, they stole the new look for her. Very good, Fiona. You get 10 points for Hufflepuff.
Sure.
Okay. Now, outside of this sort of blousiness up here, I mean, that's basically the same idea. And they were like, yes, of course we're stealing this. But But there is something about the gowns from this period that play on everything that we love in clothes. You know, whether it is the decoration, whether it is a little bit of fit and a little bit of fullness. Even here, we're seeing a silhouette that was also popular. You know, we think of that full as we hit the 40s, late 40s, early 50s. But look at the cut of that. I mean, that's a pencil skirt. And then it has this drape over the front. And that's how you have to stand in this thing, you know, or else it's just going to look like a big block. But Christian Dior, amazing. Okay.